we present a forum or a lecture on a timely topic. And so today, with the help of our colleagues from the Department of Political Science, we're going to discuss a very timely topic today. And we're going to raise the rhetorical question, is the United States a democracy or an oligarchy? And we also at Savannah State participate with the Constitution. Give me the correct name of the Constitution group. No, the association that we're working with here, the Democracy.
American Democracy Project.
Right. We're coordinating with the American Democracy Project on this discussion today. I'd like to introduce my colleagues, starting at my far left, Dr. Geoffrey Bowden, who is a professor in political science, Ms. Valerie Blanks, who is a Savannah State student, and to my right, Professor Donnie Bell. I'm going to lead off this discussion as I usually do by not assuming that you know the definitions of the terms that we're going to be discussing or the meaning of these terms. And once I do that, I'm going to turn the discussion over to Dr. Bowden, who will lead it in terms of his colleagues. So we want to first start once I get now I don't feel so bad when the technician has to take a little time to get it straight, because I'll tell you, I'm it's just the way I get it out.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And thank you all so much for coming. Actually, Dr. Ms. Johnson is a scholar in residence for Savannah State University. He began his career here as a faculty member, then later as the dean of the Oligarchy Social Sciences. He is always one to give back. He's had an illustrious career as the mayor, two-time mayor of the city of Savannah. He always wants to give back to his scholar in residence. This is his fall 2015 lecture.
Thank you very much. All right, now we can move forward. I want to begin by having you look at a definition of democracy. This is not a very complex definition, and perhaps some of our panelists will elaborate on it, either to question some of the assertions here or to reaffirm some of the assertions here. But it is basically seen as a political system for choosing and replacing the government through fair and free elections where the citizens actively participate in that process. In most democracies, you have the protection of human rights for all of the citizens, and you have as a foundation the rule of law, in which no matter what your status is in the society, the laws are supposed to apply equally to all citizens. So that's the sort of generic definition of democracy. And we're asking the question today, is the United States a democracy or an oligarchy? So it's important for us to define this next term. And an oligarchy is simply a form of government in which all power is vested in a few persons or in a dominant class or clique. To put it simply, it's the government by a few. And when you use it as a system, it is a state or organization so ruled by number one. And it also applies to the persons who are in that ruling class. Now there is a pejorative term used also to describe an oligarchy, and it's called a plutocracy. And we can have a lively debate about whether the United States is a plutocracy or an oligarchy, but the difference is that a plutocracy is a form of oligarchy. It is a society ruled or controlled by a few minority of its wealthiest citizens. So the key difference, I guess, in the way we talk about an oligarchy or plutocracy is the fact that money rules in what we would consider a plutocracy. So there can be no doubt now in your minds about what these terms mean as we go forth in our discussion. I like this little diagram because it says so much when you have opposites. Many people would say we are either a democracy or an oligarchy or plutocracy. Well, in my research and readings for this forum today, it is a combination. The United States political system is a combination of a democracy and an oligarchy. It is a democracy when we talk about general human rights and the issues of equality writ large, But when we talk about the distribution of the resources in the society, then we get into a conflictual situation between the idea of equality for all against the rule or influence, undue influence of the wealthy. So today, I hope when you leave, you'll have a better understanding of how, and I'll say our political system works. It is a combination of democracy and oligarchy. When you look at the super PACs and the lobbyists and all of the other people who the rich employ to work their will, they have far more influence over the decision-making process around things that deal with wealth. They're primarily in what one author calls wealth defense. They will allow us to argue and fight over all of those issues until it comes to a discussion about redistributive policy. And we now have a tax code of some 72,000 pages that is written primarily to defend the rich and their interests in this democracy. So with those preliminary statements, I will yield to Dr. Bowden, and then we're going to open it up for discussion, and I'm looking forward to a real lively exchange with you, because this is one of the most important concepts that we can be discussing in this year prior to us selecting a president next year. So, Dr. Bowden.
I think the way I would like to proceed at this point is to have Professor Bell come up and give his remarks, and then Ms. Blanks come up and give her remarks, and then I'll try to bring everything together and get our discussion going. So that's be weird. So it's not.
Okay, so now that you have a general understanding of what an oligarchy is, I'm going to address some questions that kind of give us evidence. Where are we in terms of a democracy or an oligarchy? Where are we going, and how are we going to get there? The first question that we're going to ask, democracies have fair, clean elections. Dr. Johnson just spoke to this. Is this the case? And the first thing I'd like to point out, the most recent Gallup poll says that 80% of us believe that elections are rigged due to money, our campaign donations. In 2012, the average cost of a Senate seat was $10 million. The result is we have candidates who are independently wealthy, or called dialing for dollars. Last week in the GOP debate, you had an exchange between Jeb Bush and Donald Trump, and Trump was lauding his ability to be independently wealthy. Bush really couldn't argue that he had donations from special interests, but then Trump kind of came over the top talking about a casino that he wanted to get in Florida, and that he said the words, "I know the right people. If I wanted it, I would have gotten it." Okay, so that's where we are. The idea that you can get a $1 million check written to you, and that that has no influence on your thinking, is a bit ridiculous. We've talked about it in American government classes and U.S. presidency. If someone wants to hand you $1 million, it's going to influence your thinking. Now, again, during the GOP debates, we've heard candidates say that they want to become president for many good reasons, and I'm not doubting that. But to say that those large amounts of money don't influence their thinking, their behavior, again, is ridiculous and not true. There is this idea of $1 equals one vote, so the more money you have, the more influence you have in politics. Is it not true that we now have a system, and this speaks to the tax code, that is unjustly influenced by the top 1%? And thus, unjustly, the rules are going to favor that 1%. Now, the second question I want to address, in a democracy, fair and clean elections result in candidates that reflect the will of the people. And let's look at the last 35 years. All right, the last 35 years, since 1980. For 28 of the last 35 years, there has been a Bush or a Clinton in the White House. For 4 of the years when we didn't have a Bush or Clinton in the White House, Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. Now, is it just a coincidence that we've had these two great families come and lead us for the vast majority of the last 35 years, or is it a result of a system that favors money, that favors certain families? Now, back to you and I. Again, if we were to receive $1 million, all right, won a lottery, got a huge raise, we would think we're rich and we're wealthy. But the wealth that we're talking about in politics is this invisible 1% that we don't really meet, okay? You and I do not interact with these people. We know them on the news, and that is not the way it's always in the United States. We talk about an American government. Again, who are the 2 richest females in the United States right now? Who? Yes, the heirs to Walmart. And how did they get their money? They were born, right? That's what they did. They didn't invent anything. They don't have some great ability. They were born. Now, I'm not up here to claim that everyone with money is a bad person or they're ruining the system. Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Oprah, these people use their money for charity. They donate to people, to groups among the different classes. But there is a problem when you have the Koch brothers who put billions into the system. Now, they don't always get their way. All right, Scott Walker is not going to be the GOP candidate, but they do have a disproportionate amount of influence on the system. Now, there needs to be rules and regulations to encourage democracy. In the 80s, if you've ever seen Wall Street, the original one, Gordon Gekko, he was a bad guy. All right, he's part of the problem. Guys like him are in jail now. Okay, we put them in jail. But the problem that I'm speaking about is this inherited wealth. It must be dealt with as exorbitant inherited wealth. The problem is not just inequality, but it is such great inequality that it's going to stretch across generations. The third question. In a democracy, the government should reflect the will of the people. Is this the case? Well, back to inequality, 400 families now have more wealth than half of the families in the USA. How does this happen? All right, and we could talk about this for 3 or 4 hours and not get too deep into it, but I'm just going to give a few reasons that this has happened. In 1955, under Eisenhower, who was a Republican, the top marginal income tax rate was 90%. Today, it's less than 40%. In 1955, there were 20 graduated tax brackets. In 2015, there are 6. The top tax bracket in 1955 was 200 grand, which factoring in inflation, that's about 1.75 million. Today, the top tax bracket is only around 440,000. So what does this mean? It means that if tax rates today were similar to where they were in 1955, every dollar someone made over 1.75 million would be taxed at a rate of 90%. Today, anyone making above that income, that money is taxed at a rate less than 40%. That is a big deal. So suggestions that I think we need to make happen. Why don't we implement 4 more tax brackets at, say, 1 million, 10 million, 100 million, and 1 billion. And we'll tax those at everything over $1 million at 60%, over 10 million, 70. Once you're making 100 million, everything over that is 80%. And if you're making over $1 billion, 90%. That'd be the tax, that'd be the highest tax bracket right there. That would be the uber wealthy. Their money over $1 billion we tax at a rate of 90%. Now, this points to a bigger question, which again, Dr. Johnson mentioned, this idea of redistribution of wealth. It's become a dirty phrase. When did this happen? Why did this happen? And how did this happen? So the final question I'm going to address, whose fault is it? And who do we claim, who do we talk about? Well, unions. People blame unions, union members. And what do they get criticized for? For getting living wages. We criticize public employees for receiving their pensions that they've worked for, that when they started working they were agreed to. We criticize professional athletes, their unions for collectively bargaining, even though their bosses, their managers, their administrators in the leagues, they negotiate their salaries. Union has become a dirty word in America. And I was watching a lecture by Dr. Drew Weston at Emory University, and he explained that there's a correlation of 0.8 between union decline and decline in wages. That is a remarkably high correlation. In the social sciences, it's about as high as it gets. Now that correlation is higher than the average temperature in a city and its distance from the equator. So that is, again, a very strong correlation. It's become commonplace to work 2 or 3 jobs with no benefits and say, well, that's just how it is now. No, that's not how it's always been, though. Now, whose fault is it? And again, this is back to Drew Weston. Democrats. It's the Democrats' fault. Why? Again, no one wants to mention redistribution of wealth. Politicians are scared to mutter the word poverty, instead speaking about the middle class, when really who are they talking about? The upper middle class and the upper class. So why is that Democrats' fault? The party that is supposed to protect human rights, the lower class, they have ceded the contentious issues to the Republicans. All right, gun control, abortion, just anything that is important to you and I, the economy. Democrats are so scared to say anything wrong that they don't say anything at all. Examples of this. Ronald Reagan, all right, in presidency class we talk about him being, he changed government, okay, for better or for worse, he made government smaller, all right, even though that's debatable as well. But let's look at what he did. How did he, an actor from California, win the entire South? How did he beat, in 1980, a peanut farmer from Georgia? Well, he came down to the South, and he talked about a code word, states' rights. All right, a code word, and it still happens today. He talked about states' rights, and that really fired up a lot of Southerners. That got them on board. That got them to trust a politician from California more than a peanut farmer. Now, how did he endear himself when he's in office that first year? He went to the Supreme Court, or took a case, made a case for the Supreme Court about Bob Jones University. Okay, Bob Jones University had tax-exempt status, and they forbid interracial dating. The case would get to the Supreme Court, it would be overturned. The Supreme Court said if they're going to forbid interracial dating, not protect human rights, we're not going to give them tax-exempt status. But what was this political decision by Reagan? He was endearing himself to a region of the country. They said, this guy is what he says he is. And that endeared himself to Southern voters, and it led to, in 1984, remember, one of the biggest landslides of all time. Now, just to bring it into Georgia politics real quick, before I conclude, 2002, Zaxby Chambliss versus Max Cleland. And this is a great example of those contentious issues. And if you don't know Max Cleland, triple amputee, all right, a veteran, and then you had this guy Zaxby Chambliss, who was not even excited about running, but Karl Rove really pushed him to run, and Karl Rove, a very good political strategist, said, we're going to hit Cleland at his strongest point. Again, this is 2002. The biggest concern at that point was national security. So you had a guy with 3 deferments. All right, remember, that is, he would not go fight. It was his knees or his back or something. And he was going after a guy for national defense who had, again, lost 3 of his limbs. And again, Cleland did not hit back. He did not counterattack. And Zaxby Chanlis would go on to win the Senate seat from him. Now, in conclusion, what will we see in 2016? Will those who address inequality, poverty, unemployment be branded? Will they suffer in the election? Or will they expose some of this influence and how certain families, certain individuals have too much influence? Will they advocate a system where the select few run the government? Or many should be excluded from the process? Again, if they do not call out our system for what it is, and who's going to be excluded, it's going to be the lower class, it's going to be minority groups. So we must confront these problems, or we're going to continue to live in a country that protects the interests of the few rather than the interests of the many.
Good morning.
Good morning.
The key purpose of a democratic government is that the people actually have a voice in legislation that will affect their everyday lives. Through historical events over the years, we've seen the Electoral College being implemented because, as some of you all may know, we do not elect the president. Our popular votes do not elect the president. The Electoral College represents the president. And who selects the Electoral College? Not the people. The government does. Like the implementation of the Electoral College, gerrymandering, photo IDs, and other voting suppression tactics keep America from being a true democracy. Because if we were actually voting for who our president may become and the legislation that is passed that affect our everyday lives, then this country would be in a completely different state than it is now. For the first time in more than a century, most of the fundraising for the presidential election is being donated in amounts of 6 figures or more from corporations and wealthy individuals. In 2008, there was a case, the Supreme Court heard a case, the Citizens United versus the FEC. And through this, money was replaced as a free speech tactic, disguising itself under the First Amendment. And I quote, "The speech is no less true because it comes from a corporation." And those are words spoken by Supreme Court justices when they were doing their concurring opinions. I was reading a blog from Huffington Post blogger Richard Askow in August of 2015. Jeb Bush's super PAC raised more than $103 million before he even officially announced his candidacy for presidency. And I find that interesting because at least 20 individuals wrote checks to Bush's super PAC for $1 million or plus, and it was estimated that 236 checks were received at like $100,000 or more dollars. And when you see him, and when you watch the government debate, like the GOP debates now, you don't see them bring up how big banks are affecting and crushing the middle class. You don't see them mention the growth of economic income inequality, how it's shrinking the middle class. You see, I'm trying to find the right word. In fact, you see more of a you kind of see a form of tyranny, actually. Oligarchies are really formed with the tyranny and oppression of the people. Like Dr. Bell mentioned, in the Koch brothers, in 2011, they have a foundation called the Charles G. Koch Foundation, and it made a grant for $1.5 million to Florida State University Economics Department, and through this, they had a advisory committee that selected classes and selected who would be the lead in selecting classes of this department. And that kind of interests me because exactly what citizens are we breeding for the next generation to run our government, to run our businesses? Even in 2014, the Koch brothers made a $25 million grant to the United Negro College Fund. And as a result, one of our biggest, I can't remember the name of the union, but one of the biggest supporters of the union that supports the United Negro College Fund has backed out. And the question that really poses to these statistics is exactly what type of citizen are we trying to breed in this new regime of government that America is becoming? Because in an oligarchy, we don't really have a voice. And you see in the GOP debates, you see the biggest discussion is the defunding of Planned Parenthood. 67% of children identify themselves as living in a single parent household or a sub-family household, which means that you being raised by your grandmother or your aunt. And by the defunding of Planned Parenthood, exactly what are we saying that these children and women can't get the proper adequate health care?
All right. All right. Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's have a discussion. I want to point out just one or two things. I'll play the devil's advocate. These aren't necessarily the things that I believe, but I will give you some historical perspective. When in the summer of 1787 they were creating the new Constitution, they made a very, very deliberate decision not to give the people direct access to the federal government, except in one area, and that was the House of Representatives. In every other area, in the Senate was indirect elections at that time. We now have direct elections in the Senate. The president is not directly elected, and we have almost nothing to do with the Supreme Court and how they get to be where they are. Okay? So there was a sense in which the Constitution, the way it's designed, is actually supposed to create this barrier between the people and the government itself. Now, it was not the intention that the government would then be run by the wealthy, but by what Thomas Jefferson called a natural aristocracy. Now, we can only imagine that Thomas Jefferson meant by that white people, because Thomas Jefferson owned a lot of slaves. So the question we have to ask ourselves is the Constitution, the way that we set it up, capable of producing that natural aristocracy, or is that at the end of the day really just going to mean rich people? Okay? We've got all kinds of interesting views here, so I'm interested to know what your questions are. We encourage our students to ask questions. Professors, you need to restrain yourselves for a little bit anyway. But we want our students to ask questions, and we'll let our panel answer them. Questions? Raise your hand if you have a question, and then stand up and ask. Two at the same time. Go ahead. Dang, stand up.
Hey guys, my name is Jiko, and I'm a junior political science major. Do any of you think there's a solution to kind of getting the few families that are in political power out of power and just opening it up to maybe regular people like me, like if I wanted to be president one day?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Go ahead.
I mentioned a term called wealth defense. And if we ever want more participation by ordinary people will have to organize themselves across all of these lines that now divide us into a considerable political force that can check the wealth defense. I want to say the wealth defense once more are the lawyers, the accountants, the lobbyists, the wealth managers, and all of the other people that work for the rich folk to make sure that public policy supports their interests. And many times, and in most cases, the support of their interests is counter to the interests of ordinary people. You can look at the accumulation of wealth among the 1%. That accumulation of wealth among the 1% was taken away from the middle class and even the lower class. But particularly, the middle class income has been flat over the last 30 years, while the accumulation of wealth among that 1% has gone out of the stratosphere. So the only way we can counter that is to organize a political movement that can be sustained to check the wealth defense that rich people have working on their behalf. Did y'all get that? Good. Okay. In other words, you got to organize the masses to take on the classes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I think that one of the biggest, perhaps the greatest hoax that's been perpetrated on the American people is the fact that democracy probably was never intended. And that a film has been played on it. Let me just put that out there, and let me just say that I think that you're not going to be able to solve this problem until you recognize that. And I think, added to that, you're not going to be able to deal with it until we deal with the understanding of how we got to this point. And how we got to this point in modern times would be slavery. And I think that if we don't get that straight and stop dodging it, we're not going to solve these problems.
Yeah. There is ample evidence to suggest that the American founders had read Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and had understood them to a large extent. And Plato and Aristotle and Cicero are very clear that they think democracy is a bad idea. Now, why is it that we advocated democracy, at least in some form, back in the 18th century? Probably because we were tired of monarchy. But on the other hand, there was a fusion of capitalism with the will of the people. And at that time, a big part of capitalism was slavery and the use of slaves to generate not only the products that were needed, but the slaves themselves became an industry in and of themselves. And so you're absolutely right. How can we possibly not think that that group of people thinking it was okay to own other human beings is not a fundamental fact that has to be considered when we think about their thinking on all these issues. So I think you're exactly right.
The support of slavery is one of the most anti-democratic ideas that you could have. And I want to say that again. The slavery is probably the most anti-democratic concept that was ever generated in the history of the world.
We have a question here and then one back here.
This is directed at Professor Bell. you said you wanted to add 4 new tax brackets to help the distribution of wealth. But wouldn't that start to lead our capitalistic society into a form of socialism which doesn't incentivize the lower class to work up?
Thank you for the question. Socialism, again, you've got Bernie Sanders running, right? And right now he is addressing a lot of the concerns that we've mentioned up here. And socialism is one of those code words that people use and brand and say, you have some socialistic ideas, you're automatically anti-American or something. So I would say no, that your theory is a little bit off. But that is, again, that is something that a lot of politicians, they say that, yes, if we're going to add tax brackets and tax the wealthy more, then that's going to give people less incentive to work. Again, if the lower class, their experiences are shared more and addressed more, no one, my theory would say that people don't want to remain in the lower class. Again, this is I guess a faith I have in the American system. That is one of those, that is that rhetoric that we hear that it's going to give, with higher unemployment benefits, that people are going to have less incentive. I just don't buy that. Yes.
Follow up. Oregon passed the minimum wage of $15 an hour, which cuts the capitalistic values of Oregon. So people started cutting their hours back because they were making more money to where they could still stay on social programs such as food stamps and welfare. So is that not like hurting the economy down in Oregon?
Well, I think it's hard to, again, it's difficult to regulate if bosses are going to cut back people's hours. That's on them. You can implement a tax code, a certain rule of regulation that would discourage them from doing so. Again, I haven't really looked into the specific case of Oregon, but again, I would say it's difficult. It's difficult to regulate how much of a boss can he cut back or what. That's kind of a case-to-case issue.
Let me ask a question. Who in this room believes that paying the workers at McDonald's $15 an hour will bankrupt McDonald's? If you believe that, raise your hand. I don't have anything else to say.
Question in the back.
Okay. Do you think having a candidate like Donald Trump would push us more to an oligarchy because he is a very wealthy man already?
Not necessarily. Government, because certain people have been able to buy their policies and lobby their own policies, they're probably, more than likely they're going to disguise it, because there's been plenty of people that are in Donald Trump's tax bracket that make more than Donald Trump, that have gotten policies enacted and legislation passed and all these other things that affect the middle class in the most horrible way possible, that have been
It may be, consider this possibility. It may be that because he can fund his own campaign, he'll be less beholden to rich folks when he's in office.
Yes. I think it's, again, what Trump is, he's a reflection of the system. The system, it doesn't make him popular. He's speaking to a large group who is frustrated, who's angry, who's mad. But again, going back to his exchange with Bush in the GOP debate, he said, if I wanted those casinos, I would have gotten them because I know the right people.
let me also say, and I've been talking to my friends about this. If you listen to Donald Trump is running to be emperor or king of the United States. He always says, I will do this, I will do that. He never references working with the Congress, who controls the purse strings to get a lot of that done that he says he's going to do. And our folk just aren't sophisticated enough to call him on that. There are some things he can do, like President Obama is doing by executive decree, but there are some things that he's saying that he's going to do that can only be done with a we, not an I, in terms of working with Congress to get those things done.
Hey, it's Joe Steffen over here, legal counsel for Savannah State. Let me suggest as an attorney, words matter. And David Mitchell, who wrote the book Cloud Atlas, suggested a term called corpocracy, which would really be a subset of oligarchy. And I think that in that work of fiction, he was suggesting that as we evolve from this balance we have between a democracy and an oligarchy in the United States and the rest of the world, that we're actually moving towards a structure of corporate ownership and corporate control where the oligarchs essentially change places, but it's the same entity. And I think not only is it a good read, but I think it's a great description of where our system appears to be moving to. The other quick point I wanted to make is that at the local level in politics, while the money is smaller and in a sense the democracy might be a bit purer, that here in Savannah that we're dealing with a very similar situation. We've got a group of oligarchs, we've got a corpocracy that essentially controls a lot of the process here in this community. So that's the input.